Dennis, but before that, I just wanted to alert you to a couple of things. I do have a handout. I'm not going to put it in your hands just yet because you don't need to be looking at it during the presentation, but when you go to exit, we are able to give you a copy of the catalog, and then there's a couple of handouts that are stuffed in the front with more information about some items in the exhibit and text. So you'll definitely want to pick up one of these. I'll put it over by the door on your way out so you can get one of those. I also want to alert you to the fact that we are having gallery host training. Gallery host is a new position that is specific to this exhibit, where we're actually wanting volunteers stationed in the exhibit room to interact with visitors as well as keep an eye on the exhibit. So the training, which I've got a reminder here, but it's also in the VIC, there's 3 different dates. They're all the same session. You just need to come to one, but I just wanted to offer a variety of times and days. And it will be a hopefully fun, informative, interactive about how best to work with visitors in a gallery space on a casual basis and working with art. Believe it or not, there is an art form to working with visitors in the gallery, and we hope that we will impart some helpful tips to you. I have several docents working with me on this, so we'll be giving you more information about the content of the exhibit, but also we'll be actually practicing our skills about how best to work with different kinds of visitors and read body cues and how to start a conversation with somebody about art. So, if you're going to be gallery hosting, this is the training for you. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ariana.
Hi, welcome. For those responsible for the nice docent lunch yesterday, you did a fantastic job. Loved it. Anyways, that's just an aside. Legally, I need to alert you that we are going to videotape our docent training today, so some people's heads will be maybe in the presentation, but just the back. And your laughter, if you laugh, or whatever, make comments, ask questions. And I hope I would have remembered that we are videotaping, because I would have done a much better job with my hair this morning. But anyways, I'm grateful that Dennis is here today. And also welcome to his wife Leslie, who sits in the back row next to Pat. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dennis before he starts telling you about the exhibit. Dennis used to be the director of the, and I always get that name wrong, and I always try to do a good job because we get really upset when people say our name the wrong way, the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. He was the director there. After that, he went to the Oakland Museum of California and was the executive director at that institution. And recently, he was the president of the Laguna College of Art and Design, and he retired from that position, and he relocated to the Santa Barbara area, and he's serving on the Santa Cruz Island Foundation board. And so Tim Schiffer approached Dennis and asked him whether he would be willing to be our guest curator for this exhibit. And he graciously accepted. And he and I worked on this exhibit together. And since he's the guest curator, however, he's got the responsibility of telling you about it. So please, Dennis, if you would come up.
Thank you, Ariana. It's a pleasure, really a pleasure to work on this exhibit with your fine staff. And it was also a treat to meet some of you. As a former museum professional, I know how much museums depend on their docents and their volunteers. So I commend you for your service to the institution and the community in this way. How many of you have been to Santa Cruz Island? Great. And I assume most of those who visited were in the Central Valley, so you saw the ranch houses, or were you just on shore and ranch house? Have you been to the Central Valley? Great. Good. So you know a little bit about the setting. What I wanted to do today is talk a little bit about how the exhibition came about, and my remarks will be fairly brief. I want to leave time for questions if Ariana and Wendy will say that's okay. I want to give you a very brief and not scholarly history of Santa Cruz Island. I want to talk about how this art collection itself came about, and a little bit that might be useful in your docent talks, again, just touching on how it fits into art history in the larger sense. And finally, we'll go through some images, and I'll just offer a few anecdotes about some of the images, some of which you may want to pass on to visitors to the museum as they come here. First of all, though, the credit to come up with this idea of having this exhibit goes to your former director, Tim Schiffer. He and the director of what's called the Santa Cruz Island Foundation, and I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment, thought it would be great to do an exhibition here of artworks in the collection of the Santa Cruz Island Foundation. Tim then left Ventura, unfortunately, and as the museum was thinking about how to mount this exhibit, I was very happy to step forward and volunteer, and was that volunteering was accepted, and it's been a great relationship ever since. But the collections themselves, as you know, anyone curating an exhibit has to find the work, come up with some ideas for the labels, and if a publication is needed, also contribute to that. The artwork in this exhibit are from three sources. First, we took some of the paintings that I like the best out of the ranch house on Santa Cruz Island. So there are a few walls that are without artwork. Second, there was a set of works by the painter Richard Diebenkorn that were of such value, historically as well as monetarily, that they were moved to storage at the Santa Barbara Art Museum. So there was a selection of what I thought would be the most useful for this exhibition from the Santa Barbara Art Museum. And finally, the Santa Cruz Island Foundation itself has an office in Carpinteria, and they have artworks on their walls too. So that was the third source of paintings. I would guess we have maybe 10% of what the Santa Cruz Island Foundation owns, and I hope it's most useful for telling a story. Briefly, and I think this kind of sets the context of how these paintings relate to the islands. I wanted to go over very quickly some of the key dates for Santa Cruz Island. I think many of you know that the island name, Santa Cruz, came from the legend, probably true, that when Portola in 1769 visited the island, one of the priests allegedly inadvertently left a staff with a cross on it on the island. The Indians found that and returned it to that priest, and so the name, they decided to name the island the Holy Cross, or Santa Cruz. And incidentally, there is Richard Diebenkorn, one of the artists in the exhibit, did an image for the flag for the Santa Cruz Island. It has that cross on it, on a hill and so forth, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we show some slides. In 1839, Santa Cruz Island was granted to Andres Castillero, and that was a Mexican land grant. It was much of the land of California, and I'm sure land here too was granted. 30 years later, 1869, a group primarily of San Francisco developers, businessmen, created what was called the Santa Cruz Island Company, and their goal was to actively ranch the island. And the first painting that we're going to show later kind of depicts what it might have been like in those early cattle ranching days with Mexican vaqueros working the land, working the herds. So that was 1869. In the 1880s, one member of the Santa Cruz Island Company, Justinian Care by name, wanted to acquire sole ownership and eventually did that by buying out his partners. It's interesting that during the Care era, the ranching methods stayed very much the same as they were earlier, whereas ranching and farming and so forth on the mainland began to modernize a bit. But the island wanted to stay a little bit more, I guess, historic. And as a result, it wasn't as economically as successful as it would have liked to have been. And so the island had to change hands again. And in 1937, Edwin Stanton, the father of Carrie Stanton, purchased the western 9/10 of the island. And he also wanted to continue ranching, but attempted to modernize it a little bit. When Edwin Stanton passed away, his son, Dr. Carrie Stanton, took on the ranch. Now, Carrie Stanton was at that moment, or at that time, training to be a doctor, and eventually completed his studies at Stanford to be a doctor of pathology primarily. Those plans changed, and he never actively practiced because he went on to the island to take over the management of the western 9/10. The reason they didn't take over all of the island is part of the Kerr family wanted to hang on to the east end and didn't want to sell to anybody regardless, so they kept their part. In 1978, Dr. Stanton agreed to sell his land to the Nature Conservancy because he didn't want the government to get a hold of it, he didn't want private ownership, he didn't want it developed, he didn't want it overrun with too many people. I knew Dr. Stanton in the 70s up till the time he died because he was on my board at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History at that time. And he was an interesting man to work with. He was stubborn in many ways, very opinionated in many ways, but also very generous in many ways. His willingness to contribute, or pardon me, to sell his land at a very reasonable price to the Nature Conservancy was indicative of that. In 1987 then, Dr. Stanton died and ownership actually of the land passed to the Nature Conservancy. His personal possessions and the rest of his estate, however, went to a foundation that he had established 2 years before he died, and that is the Santa Cruz Island Foundation. And that's the entity that owns all artwork that's in storage and that's on display here. And as I mentioned earlier, the director of the Santa Cruz Island Foundation, working with your former director, came up with the thought that, gee, this would be a good exhibit to have. They came up with a title, and that was about it. So I have the privilege of going in and deciding which artworks we're going to show, and I hope that it's going to be successful. So how did the collection come about? I did mention that only a fraction of the exhibit or of the collection is on display, but the entire collection is in some way due to Dr. Carrie Stanton solely. We don't know if any of the earlier artworks that are on display were purchased by his parents. We suspect not, but we don't have records to indicate whether he did inherit it, but we think not. Mainly, he purchased the paintings himself for various reasons. The island landscape paintings were purchased either for sentimental value or to decorate the ranch house. The Diebenkorn paintings, that special subset that's in the exhibit and that's owned by the foundation, was a result of his friendship, a lifelong friendship with Richard Diebenkorn. He not only purchased paintings from galleries, meaning Carrie Stanton, but the Diebenkorn family became close friends with Stanton, and they would come to the island to visit in the summer and so forth. And every time Richard Diebenkorn came out, he would sketch, get ideas, relax, and they'd go have picnics on the beach and drink wine and generally reconnect. So the families stayed close. And the third component of the exhibit are paintings that were purchased after Dr. Stanton's death, but with money that he left to the Santa Cruz Island Foundation. And a lot of those paintings are of more contemporary plein air artists. So these are landscape paintings of artists who are still around today, still doing great work. Now I want to just talk very briefly about how this all ties into art history in general, in case any of you have an interest in that and want to communicate in any of your talks to visitors. Almost all of the artworks in the exhibition tie to the land in some way, and most of those specifically, obviously, to Santa Cruz Island. Landscape painting in general, I think, as most of you know, has evolved significantly over about 500 years. The Renaissance painters were brilliant painters with great attention to detail. detail, a lot of accuracy. And a lot of those landscapes, though, did have figures in them. That was all through the 14th and 17th centuries. The Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists got looser with their brush style, tried to capture light, and those paintings would be sketchy, and probably a Renaissance painter would have failed a successful Impressionist painter because it would have looked like they didn't know how to paint. But obviously that was an important movement and moved on. And some of the art in the exhibition has that loose brush stroke, more attempt to capture light, a little bit rougher, but it somehow captures a mood and an interesting scene. And finally, then there was abstract works that either became abstract by evolving from some early sketch and landscape, or it's just an abstract painting to begin with, but brought to the artist's mind something of the land. In the classic realistic style, and let's just put that up for a moment. In the very classic realistic style of painting is William Hahn's Mexican Cattle Riders. This was done in 1881. It's a formal work. Very clearly, while it doesn't, it's much more brilliant when you see it in the gallery. So a lot of the images that we managed to get for the catalog and here eventually came out in printed pieces and on the slides is rather dull. They're not when you see them. But a lot of detail, nicely rendered, formal, good composition. And that's something that would have been very typical of 1881, just on the cusp of the sort of that looser style that I mentioned too. Also, for those of you who can remember this painting and have a great visual memory, when you go into the gallery, you'll see the vaqueros are right in the other direction. So don't worry about the fact that this got flipped. It's still the same painting. Interesting thing about this painting. Well, let me hold off on that because I want to show another one, and this would be the Madonna painting. Also, the colors on this one are much more brilliant. This is also a formal work by an unknown artist, and it's titled Nuestra Señora del Refugio, Our Lady of Refuge. Also very formal style. So these are the two paintings that really kind of harken back to an earlier genre in the history of art. While we have this up, I might as well tell you a story about this painting. Again, this is kind of an interesting anecdote. This painting was hand carried from Mexico to Alta, California by Bishop Garcia Diego y Moreno in 1842. So that painting made a long trek. To me, it's quite obviously done by a European a painter. Probably came across on a boat somewhere, a ship, and then was hand carried during the mission era. This was 8 years before California statehood. This painting came into Carrie Stanton's possession by a friend of his who was very active in the Santa Barbara mission, a woman named Rosario Coletti, and she was very touched and attached to this painting because she said she was born under it and she died under it. And so for Carrie Stanton to acquire it because he was very good friends with her meant a lot to him. Could we go briefly back to the Hahn? I can't remember if I mentioned the catalog. Yeah. Did I say to you how Carrie Stanton acquired this one yet? Okay, let me mention that. Yeah. This was another example of how all this collection is somehow due to Carrie Stanton. On his parents' 35th wedding anniversary, he bought this for them as an anniversary present. And from the time that he did that, it was hanging over the main fireplace in the main ranch house called the Justinian House on Santa Cruz Island. So it's an important work for the history of the island, to be sure. Okay, thank you. In the and don't put these slides up yet. In the more impressionist style, you'll see the works of Carl Oscar Borg and Alexander Harmer, important names in the history of California painting. And then the more post-impressionistic style bordering on abstract are some of the sketches by Richard Diebenkorn. And there are some purely abstract works too, which evolved from his Panadine sketches. So, let's go back one more time, sorry, to the Hahn painting. I wanted to give you a little bit of information about Hahn in case someone asks you or knows that artist. It's H-A-H-N. And Hahn lived from 1829 to 1887. Originally from Germany, he clearly received a very traditional art education in Dresden and in Dusseldorf. The name William Keith might ring a bell to you because Hahn came over and in Boston met William Keith, who was a very important painter in his own right, and in Boston, and they worked together in New York, and they eventually came to San Francisco together and established their studios here, and that was in about, as I recall, about 1870. So Hahn is a notable part of California's art history, and paintings from his hand are held in a number of museums. As a matter of fact, there have been some recent major catalogs and monographs of Hahn's work. And we became aware of the fact that they said they knew he did a certain number of paintings, but one was missing. And it turned out of all the ones listed, this one was the missing one. So now that it's on exhibit, the scholars are going to know that the whole collection is complete. So he is held by a number of major museums and is a pretty important painter. Okay, let's see if we can find a Harmer now. Alexander Harmer was part of that transition from the more formal style to the more impressionistic style, although he wasn't obviously relevant in his painting, early impressionistic. He was originally, he lived from 1865 to 1925. He's originally from New Jersey. He studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art under Thomas Akins, and that name should ring a bell to some of you. In the 1890s, Harmer came to settle in Santa Barbara, created a little studio there on De La Guerra Plaza, and as a result, he sort of became a magnet for other younger painters, and they would hang out, talk, paint together, and so he became, as I said, kind of a magnet for the art scene in Santa Barbara was emerging at that very early time. He's also regarded by some as one of Southern California's first great painters of the 19th century. Do we have another one of his too? Is that it? Okay. The Madonna and Child painting I mentioned, we don't need to see that again. There was one large oil painting that was a favorite of Stanton's, and that's Borg's, Carl Oscar Borg's painting called Captain McGuire Catching Seal. This again has that looser, more impressionist style, and Borg too was an important part of California's art scene in the early 1900s. He was Swedish, lived from 1879 to 1947. He was known primarily for his themes of the Southwest, not too many from the islands or from California. In 1901, he sailed for the U.S. and once year taught at the California Art Institute in Los Angeles, a fine institution that still has an evolved institution still going today, and the Santa Barbara School of the Arts, which doesn't exist any longer. He also became a protege of the philanthropist Phoebe Hearst. The interesting thing about this painting is, as I mentioned, in 1978, Cary Stanton signed a document with the Nature Conservancy that said, you can have my land when I die. As I said, it was a sale, but it was not a market value sale. It was a pretty good price for the Nature Conservancy. To reward himself, he'd always loved this painting. So he went to the gallery that owned it. It was a Montecito gallery, and bought it for himself as a present. From kind of a historic standpoint, In those days, seals were caught and shipped off to circuses and zoos and so forth. And Captain McGuire was one of the locals who would actually go out to the islands, capture seals, bring them in, and then sell them. So it picks a kind of an interesting activity that obviously doesn't take place any longer, but the artist is also very important. Okay, who else do we have that's sort of a historian? Let's go to the chapel paintings. In the exhibit we have, there's a small chapel on the island, and this was put there for the vaqueros during the ranching days. It's been remodeled, still exists today, still the same size, and in it are hanging a number of historic paintings. You've seen the Madonna picture, that's one of them, and there are several like that. But also, there are some small paintings called, in the general sense, retablos. And they're tiny little paintings that are done usually by outsiders, maybe amateurs, and they have inscriptions generally. Do we have another one up there that might? Any more? Is that it? Every two pictures? Yeah. They sometimes have inscriptions that tell a story, and very often these paintings were done to thank a holy figure, a saint, or God, or Jesus, for something that happened to the person that painted it. And this was, we've had a couple of these translated for you, so they're on the labels in the gallery, and I thank Ariana and her crew here for having that done. I believe this is one where a couple was traveling and they were accosted potentially by some vaqueros or bandits, and Our Lady of Guadalupe rescued them. And so this man painted that and kind of told that story, and that was a way of giving back thanks. So I think those are kind of interesting historically. And they're on display right next to the big formal Madonna picture. I'd like to go to Richard Devenport first. Now we do that. Okay, good. Richard Devenport's early work is often categorized as abstract expressionism, and he's certainly an important part of the Bay Area figurative movement of the 1950s and 60s. There's a series of his called the Ocean Park series that now, any individual painting is probably worth easily 7 figures, if not more, and held by a number of major museums, and the series often travels and has blockbuster exhibits. So the Ocean Park series has really achieved worldwide acclaim. The island work spanned about 40 years, from 1943 to 1984. They're much more modest, obviously, than what you'd see in the Ocean Park series. And they do represent a unique personal dialogue between the island owner and the artist. Kerry purchased some of these that you'll see. He also was given some as presents. In the exhibit, there is one progression that I thought was kind of interesting and tells a story. It starts with a scene out of a bedroom window where guests stayed and where Richard Devenport stayed when he visited Stanton. And there were 4 studies. The first one was this sketch of the Santa Cruz Island Central Valley's winery, looking out a closed screen door from an upstairs bedroom window. Do we have the next one in the sequence? If you want to just go through those slowly through the sequence, that'd be great. The progression goes on with a little bit more refinement. This is, I can't recall if this is charcoal or it looks a little like charcoal to me from here, but the first one was ballpoint pen on paper. And the next one. He then did the same scene in watercolor, and that looks very much like you would expect to see out the bedroom window. There are 2 dog blankets hanging on a purple thing that are hanging on a railing. There's the roof of the building below on the first story, the winery, and the trees behind. And then the final picture is very much in Devenport style, and he titled this Ocean View Santa Cruz Island. Well, it's not anywhere near the ocean, but what he's done is changed enough of it to make it an ocean view. But those rectangles, those streets, don't look like anything that you might say is realistic. Yet, it clearly evolved from those sketches. So all 4 of those are on display, and you might want to point those out to people. It's kind of an interesting progression. There's the final one is the cigar box. Okay. There is another, right in the exhibit 2, there's a little thing that is painted on a, yeah, that's about actual size too. I don't know, like when you get your catalog, you'll see that purely abstract, not based on anything landscapey that I know about, painted on a cigar box lid, and that's the pure Diebenkorn abstract style, and that again was in Carrie Stanton's possession. And curiously, I don't know how many of cigar box lids he did. Let's say a half a dozen. They are highly acclaimed right now. I think they probably are going for the high 6 figures. You know, modest little thing that he probably just threw out for fun. That's how important it is. And that's one of the reasons why we don't keep those paintings in the Santa Cruz Island Foundation office around the island. In another section of the gallery are some more recent works, and Ray Strong might be a place to start. And most of these paintings now have been collected by the Santa Cruz Island Foundation after Carrie Stanton's passing away. The first one, though, was collected by Stanton. This is the artist Ray Strong. And he became a very important figure, just like Harmer was almost a century earlier, in having young artists evolve around him, paint with him, learn from him, be inspired by him. He was like a mentor. This was one, probably not in the best artistic compositional style of Ray Strong, who was also collected by a number of major museums. But it is certainly an accurate portrayal of the time of the Central Valley Ranch House. Ray Strong was born in 1905 and lived till 2006. He was greatly important in founding the artist collaborative called the Oak Group, which is based in Santa Barbara. The Oak Group went on to become very fine landscape painters, almost always painting outdoors, occasionally finishing their works in studios, but they also ended up painting landscapes that needed to be saved, meaning not the paintings, but the scenes themselves. So many times they would organize group shows and give proceeds of the paintings to the very land that they were painting. So they became very much concerned with the environment and trying to increase awareness among people of the value of the land that they were seeing in their paintings. Ray Strong also was a muralist, and if any of you have been in the Bird Hall dioramas at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, he's responsible for all of those, which have become sort of a local historic treasure. So he did influence the Oak Group, and if we have any Oak Group paintings, we can just sort of go through those quickly. That's the Harmer, I believe. This is Meredith Abbott. We have, I think, 5 or 6 of her paintings in the show. This is a scene of the Central Valley. Next, please. We don't have these in any order. They were just Richard Slosh. We have 2 of his paintings in the exhibit. He's brilliant at capturing raking light, either sunset or at dawn. A very fine painter. Is that it, or do we have?
We have Glenna Hartman, the pastel. This one.
There we go. Glenna Hartman is in. We have a few of her paintings in. Pardon me. She was expert at pastel, so that's a different medium, and it's going to come off in a different feeling to it. It's going to be a lot softer. And I think that's probably enough for now, unless you find any treasures in there.
This is Ludmilla Welsh.
Oh, Ludmilla Welch. Oh, okay. I know I put Ludmilla Welch in. Ludmilla Welch, we have a couple of her paintings in. The only story I have about this particular painting is, if any of you know Los Angeles historic history, you may have heard of the Doheny family. Granddaughter of Larry, or the daughter of Larry Doheny, who was the granddaughter of the original Doheny, got married on the island to a local man named Buzz Bonsall. And Larry Doheny gave Carrie this painting as a thank you for letting them get married on the island. So just a little anecdote of another way that the Stantons had acquired paintings. So again, she was not as well known as any of the other artists that you see in the exhibit, but I thought that was kind of a cute story. Again, the connections of the island families and other important figures in the history of California. With that, I would like to close and again commend you for being here and doing the work that you do, and thanking the people at the museum for the opportunity to work with you. It's really been a treat for me. So if there's time, I'll answer questions, maybe or Ariana, but that's certainly up to you.
There's absolutely time. So, and if there's an image that you want me to bring back up, if you had any thoughts or questions about a particular painting or artist, just let me know and I can try to get that back up. Is there any thoughts, questions about any of the artwork? It'll come to you later.
Well, I'm not far away, so if there is any, I'm sure that Ariana can answer most of your questions, but if there are any others, let me know.
Marcia might have a lot to say. These paintings are very interesting, and certainly having Cuban core, very interesting. What to relate is to the story of the islands, other than they were owned by Dr. Stanley.
I think in two ways. One, how they relate to the island is, yes, but they are clearly scenes of the island, most of them. The little religious paintings were paintings that are in there, so people that use the chapel, they help create the environment within the chapel. I suppose that would be a small way. But to me, I come away with the fact that that island owner, in one way or another, whether he bought the paintings, and I don't think he inherited, had been given to him as gifts, and his partnership with David Court, or with the money that he left to the foundation afterward, allowed that collection to be created. So really, I look at Stanton as kind of the spark of all of that.
Is there anything about what was going on with the island, with regard to the island, the mainland, the politics of it all, that is in any way expressed in the art?
The question is if is there any way that what's going on with the island politically, historically, in the art?
You all here, do you want him to have a microphone?
And I don't know of any. The only one thing that obviously that the William Hahn scene of the cattle driver, which clearly wasn't painted on the island or was about the island, kind of depicts the ranching, that old ranching style. That was true on the mainland too. It just lasted longer up there. But did you have any particular political or other sort of event in mind that that you wanted?
Well, I mean, there's everything from the historic, there's the Chumash occupation, which is certainly not shown in this.
Exactly. No. This only relates to the landscape as it exists now or recently, a little bit about the ranching history, but nothing about the Chumash Indian settlement or the mission period. So it doesn't go back. There's nothing depicted in there that goes back.
I think a point that's important, especially it relates to the Oak group, but also just, a lot of the early paintings, of course, are at a time when photography was just black and white, and a lot of things weren't documented through photography. So sometimes having these historic paintings that portray a scene that we would have no, even if there's artistic license in it, it still is actually a historic document in the sense of seeing, for example, like catching the seal or something that would not have ever probably been documented, and especially not in color. So, there's some aspect of having a glimpse into history through some of the artwork.
Yeah, Wendy makes an interesting point about the seal painting. I've never seen a photograph of any of the people who collected seals commercially for the zoos and the islands. There doesn't correspond. So that kind of indicates the methods they would use. The wooden crates, the little boats, and it looked almost like Painted Cave, an area called Painted Cave on the island where the painting is. So, yeah. But yes, you couldn't use this art exhibit to illustrate the history of the island from the Indian up to the ranch, the Nature Conservancy, the Park Service, and present day. You have to imagine Good. Okay, well, the one thing I guess I'll just close with this. In some ways, I think that this exhibit is, even though it doesn't address a linear history like as you suggested, I think it's perfect for this museum because you are about art and you are about history, and both are kind of tied up in this particular assemblage. So again, my thanks.
Thank you. One tiny little tidbit, and it seems like common sense, but as a representative of the museum administration, I just need to say this, that, and Linda may have covered this in her training, I wasn't there. In terms of the value of the paintings, especially the demon cords, that is for in-house knowledge. In terms of, that's not something that you want to immediately, of course they're valuable, but we don't want to get into any sort of specific or, wow, these ones are particularly, the most valuable type of thing, just in terms of a security sense. So although that's interesting to us, it's just not something we want to necessarily be stressing in our interactions with visitors that, not to tip anybody off as far as that goes. So that's kind of common sense, but I just thought I would say it, because it is actually interesting. And in fact, when we work with kids, that's one of the first things they'll ask us, how much is that worth? Or, how much did that cost? So, any other questions that have occurred to you in the meantime, or comments or thoughts? Of course, we want you to go in the gallery and take a look. Obviously, yes, these PowerPoint images do no justice to the paintings themselves. And there are details you might not, I won't put it back up, but in the Lumilla Welch, in a little corner, there's a couple ladies doing a very interesting little project. So you need to look closely at some of the paintings to really get all the detail in them. And then when you come if you're coming to the gallery host training, I'll have more handouts about island history and that sort of thing, so that you would have more tidbits on that if you're interacting. So, and I'll put those in the front desk binder as well. So thank you all for coming.